Hello. We're back
Hello.
for another season of the Hen House at Home. I'm Toby Harper.
And I'm Monica Fernandez.
And thank you so much for joining us to celebrate our fall 2021 authors and their incredible books. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that the land that Monica and I are broadcasting from is the occupied and seized territory of the Gabrielino, Tonga, and Kizh people. Last season, we began our events with this native land acknowledgement, coupled with a history of the Tonga people, their way of life, and the efforts that communities are taking today to preserve their culture. This season, we will be highlighting Indigenous writers and their recently published work across the country, so take notes. Today's event highlights climate and environmental fiction, so to go along with that theme, we're thrilled to share Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabashig Rice, an award-winning novel described by Publishers Weekly as a slow-burning thriller that is also a powerful story of survival and will leave readers breathless. From the book's description, with winter looming, a small northern Anishinaabe community goes dark. Cut-off people become passive and confused. Panic builds as the food supply dwindles. Frustrated by the building chaos, a group of young friends and their families turn to the land and the Anishinaabe tradition in hopes of helping their community thrive again. Blending action and allegory, Moon of the Crusted Snow upends our expectations. Out of catastrophe comes resilience, and as one society collapses, another is reborn.
That sounds so good. I cannot wait to buy that. I'm hopping over to bookshop.org and getting my copy right now.
Yeah, we're dropping that link right now, so all of you can check that out. And so from snow, we come to fire, flood, drought, and tornadoes. And we will turn to Red Hen's upcoming CLI-FI books, From the Caves by Thea Prieto and Sinking Islands by Cai Emmons. We are so thrilled to have them here today to discuss their books and the writing process. And Monica will be moderating this discussion, so take it away, Monica.
Thanks so much, Toby. See you later. I am so excited for this conversation. I couldn't put either of these books down, and I finished each of them in 2 days. I just devoured them. They are beautifully written and approach climate fiction from such different angles, and I'm so excited to explore those angles with them today. For now, let's welcome them to the screen. Welcome, Cai and Thea. Hello. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you. For those of you who aren't aware, our dear Cai was recently diagnosed with ALS, a progressive neurodegenerative disease that has affected Cai's speech. She'll be using an assistive speech device for our conversation. I'd love to start off with some readings from each of your books to showcase your beautiful prose. Thea, how about we start with you?
Absolutely. In that case, I think I'm going to jump you all into chapter 2. There's a whole lot that goes on in chapter 1. But I think that at the most fundamental, all that you need to know at this point to begin hearing this excerpt is that one of the main characters, Green, has died, and all of the characters are kind of dealing with their grief in that fact right now. The characters also live in a very post-apocalyptic setting. They live inside a cave to hibernate kind of against the winter, or not the winter storms, the summer storms. So let's begin there. The morning heat has already pounded the air to waving when Sky follows Mark into the dark mouth of the cave, keeping the pulse of Mark's footsteps ahead of him and his fingertips outstretched to the uneven stone walls. Blackness soon presses up to his nose. A damp chill covers his sweaty skin, and after 10 paces, Sky feels a cold yawning pass him on his left, the entrance to the tunnel that leads to the deeper sleeping chambers. Another 10 paces forward, with the walls narrowing inward, a splinter of kindling from the firewood pile pokes his left foot, and then Sky turns right into the oldest, tallest tunnel that leads to the storeroom. Daylight flecks the ceiling and reveals the high cracks in the rock overhead, the fractures that jag up to the surface, and Sky's eyes adjust to the pink beams that brighten swirls of dust. The air in the tunnel is warming with the heat of the day and Sky and Mark's combined breath, but the floor's mix of brick and scoured stones still feel cool underfoot. Then the tunnel widens beyond Sky's reach. He ducks again into complete darkness and he knows he has reached the storeroom. He freezes in place with his arms still spread. No babies allowed, Mark always warned him, so Sky waits quietly on the brick step that has been permitted to him in the past, his senses perked to the upturned dirt nearby, the dense smell of water, the damp of growing things. He can also hear the padding of bare feet and fingernails scratching rock, Mark's movements quick and sure, even in blackness. He navigates the important room with such ease that Sky's eagerness dips, and a moment later, a blink of light. A brick slides out of the far wall and into Mark's orange-lit palm. The open rectangle of sunlight falls across the rows of large water drums, the chipped clay pots, and glints against the edges of glass jars stacked to catch evaporation. A peeling shard of mirror next to Sky helps jump the light across the room, and when he squints, he can just see the small hand-drawn scratches in the clay of the opposite wall, the long and detailed counting marks. "Don't touch these," says Mark, gesturing to one row of drums with cracked plastic lids. "This water is already filtered and separated, and it's ready to be boiled. All the new water goes in this barrel, and don't step there." Sky jumps back from his first step into the corner of the storeroom, and Mark drops to the ground, feeling the dirt where Sky's foot landed. A long, quiet while Mark examines the squashed soil, his thick shoulders bunching, and when he stands, his hands are on his hips, his face glaring at Sky, who stands nervously, disappointed. "I've made a mistake already." "Where you just stepped," yells Mark, "is where all the summer roots are planted. See, that's the barrel that leaks, it goes on top." "It was Green's idea," adds Mark, his voice quieter. Another moment without speaking, except now the silence is heavy and leaking. Sky is almost grateful when Mark points out the scratches on the wall and begins explaining the different columns and tallies, when his voice has regained all of its familiar bitterness. Mark's words clip off the stone ceiling, driven down into the top of Sky's head, and he doesn't interrupt Mark, even though he already knows the symbols for counting days and seasons from the other tunnels. He doesn't know, though, the system for tracking the tides, the firewood supply, the water per person, the shredded tarps they use for washing, or the digging schedule. As Mark speaks, Sky's attention trails up the lighted wall, following a long line of square-shaped dots and fingernail-sized indents. Up close, he can finally see the line of dots continues to the ceiling, filling the high walls and winding all the way around the storeroom, hundreds and hundreds of small arcs and loops. In the hardest, oldest clay, where the walls are propped by iron beams, the dots are not dots at all, but tightly gathered and overlapping markings, an intricate pattern of grouped scratches. Each tiny figure is different than the one that follows, a string of shapes increasingly more complicated and interesting and exciting. "What are those?" interrupts Sky. "Don't you know what writing is?" says Mark. Sky ducks his face. "What's it mean?" Mark tilts his head to the side, itches his scalp. "I know what these mean." Mark points him to the other side of the room where the long pattern tapers sharply to just a few short strings of figures. There, above a heap of corroded metal coils, the square dots are not intricate at all, only plain, blunt punches in the clay. "That means Ty's name," says Mark, squinting and pointing at a single dot with 18 indents next to it. "And that's Green's name," says Mark, picking out another dot. The 25 scratches next to his name means 25 years. Sky's ribs clutch his jumping heart, and he suddenly wants to lean across the water drums to trace Green, his name, his age, although he's sure Mark wouldn't allow it. Instead, he shapes the word green in his mouth while looking at the imprint, moves his teeth and tongue as though Green might spring from this small, hushed language. But only his own memories live in Sky's garbled sadness, of Green spending time alone in the storeroom, Sky peeking unseen from the tunnel, cautious not to disturb him. "Time to think," Green called it, his body half hidden among the supplies, back shaking with prayers and sobs as his fingertips trace the walls. "And this scratch," thinks Sky, his fingers raised toward the clay. "This scratch is Green's name. It belongs to him. Green's voice, his determination and hope, They are supposed to be here, stamped in the storeroom, but the plain dot does not even hold the jagged and painful fact of Green's death. It is only a spot, a depression, no detail, no voice, no memory at all. Mark points to another dot on the wall. And that's Mother's name, he says, and Sky shies from another dangerous past. He quickly notices, though, two other names in a line below hers, one name with 16 indents next to it, the other with 9 indents. So when names are close, does that mean family? Says Sky, the words skipping unguarded from his lips. It doesn't matter, frowns Mark, turning away. Stop asking so many questions. So that's your name, says Sky, pointing, and that one's mine. You know nothing about family, Mark snaps, flipping around so fast Sky stumbles backward into the dark shapes of the room. One of his hands plunges through a cracked lid into a water drum. A loud splash, warm drips down his arm against his chest, and Mark is screaming. Waste, he yells. You'll kill us wasting water. Sky runs from the storeroom, his naked shoulders scraping the sides of the tunnel, loosening sand to the floor. In the main passageway, he trips over the firewood pile, retreats deeper into the cave's narrowing void between outcrops and overhang of rock, but Mark's words still echo. You killed Mother, you'll kill us too. At the end of the passage, where the tunnel ends in fallen boulders, Sky grips the steel poles that support the remaining roof of the cave. His rash shoulders burn inward as his face burns outward. There is water on his face and on his hands, his salty crying mixing with the water from the drum, ruining it, ruining everything. I don't deserve to have anyone or anything. Please, only to please you, Mark, my brother. Will I always be this way? A scratch, a dot. Maybe we end there.
That was so great. Thank you so much, Thea. I really loved your prose, and I loved just reading. It was such a fast read for me, and it gets so heart-wrenching towards the end. But we'll talk about that in just a second. But thank you so much for sharing that wonderful passage. I am honored to read a couple of passages from Seeking Islands on Kai's behalf. So I am super excited to do this. Thank you so much, Cai, for the honor. The story follows several different characters from across the world. Analu and Penina in an island off the South Pacific, Patty in Kansas, Felipe from Sao Paulo, and of course, returning characters from Kai's first book with us, Weather Woman. Right now, we'll get a glimpse at Analu, Penina, and Patty's perspectives. Before they left the island, it was Analu's habit to canoe along the shore at sunset. The sea was unusually calm then, a quiet mutter beneath the keel. Skipjacks and big eyes swarmed to the water's surface, sensing Analu's proximity, puckering their lips for insects and to kiss the fading day. The sun would plummet suddenly, becoming dense and heavy, losing the will to hold itself up. As dusk deepened, the island's lights poked the dark, but eventually the stars tossed across the sky like rice, won out in brilliance, and he felt lifted, a tiny, insignificant thing, invisible as salt in the sea. It comforted him to feel such loneliness. It was that very loneliness that linked him to everything: the departed sun, the stars, the moon, his dead children. But on the last evening before their departure, he and Neilani sat on the beach together, legs pressed into the cool sand, thinking the same thoughts and different ones, wondering how it would be. They had no way of knowing, not really. There were the occasional bulletins from people who had gone before them, one family to Indonesia, one to New Zealand. It wasn't as they expected, they said, but how it was they couldn't say, which left Analu wondering if he and Neilani were making a big mistake. The island had become for him a winking hologram of beauty and sadness, back and forth, even now as twilight bellied down, emptying the world of malice, promising the possibility of peace and the passing of grief, even at this beautiful hour as the smell of excrement wafted over them and trash fluttered in their sightlines. And when they walked home, they would find Tamati beneath his favorite coconut tree, snoring loudly, reeking of alcohol. A sudden scream, brief but unsettling, rose from the cluster of houses where Penina, Their 11-year-old daughter and Annaloo's mother, Vailea, awaited them. Vailea did not want to come with them. She could not, she said, leave the island. She didn't want another life. Her feet were bad from the diabetes. She didn't like to walk too far. You go. Leave me here. Your sisters will care for me. What would happen in the next flood, when the waters would rise higher, which surely they would? Everyone said so. They might rise to Annaloo's house, flooding the sewage system along the way. Dysentery always followed the floods, and death. Henny and Ipo both went that way. Henny at 3, Ipo at 9 months, their bodies drained. Beautiful daughters, but so fragile. Penina was their strong one. They were leaving mostly for her. No, Vailea insisted, I won't go. And it made Annaloo sometimes wish that the waters would rise more quickly, as they did in the Bible, an irresistible tsunami of water, netting them all like fish, so they could go together, willingly, in joyous surrender. He and Neilani waited until the fish surfaced to say goodnight, and the village exhaled quiet, and all they heard was the geckos clicking, the rustling of curlews and noddies, the whisper of fronds. All the things that might sadden them were in the past, so the island had only one face. It was a sweet thing, dear to them. Holding hands, they made their way home. Penina, concealed by the dark, stood on a rocky promontory, watching her parents make their way up the beach and enter the trees. How old they looked, how bent and sad. For them, leaving the island was a terrible thing. They wouldn't have been leaving if it weren't for her, and while she felt guilty for that, she was also really happy to be going. She loved the island as much as they did, but she was also keen to see the world beyond. She'd seen glimpses of that world when Kimo's internet was working. The cities and cars and mansions, people making music and movies and dancing wildly, everyone with a cell phone and wearing fancy clothes. There were elephants and tigers in that other world, cows and horses and hummingbirds and even polar bears. Ice cream all the time, so much. She marveled at her cousins, same blood but so different. They had no interest in leaving. They didn't believe the island was sinking, despite what many people said. How could they keep thinking that when they saw the water rising every year? Maybe she thought differently because her sisters had died. But even if the island wasn't sinking, how could you not want to see other things, know other things? To her, that was crazy. Sure, the island was special, but there was so much more, and she was ready to see as much as she could. She leapt from rock to rock until she reached the sand, still warm under her toes. She slipped out of her clothes and waded in until the water draped her shoulders, then rose to her chin. Her hair swarmed across the surface, shimmering with starlight. The water lapped her lips, and she lapped back, the salty taste of her own blood. She stroked out and rolled onto her back, so she and the stars blinked at each other. Alone and together. Blink, blink. I see you, I don't. I see you, I don't. I'm the luckiest girl in the world. Goodbye, stars. Goodbye, water. Goodbye, sky. Goodbye, island. What a good place to be born. The best, really. But now her future was out there in the world beyond. Tomorrow it would all finally begin after so much back and forth, so much yes and no, so much planning. They would get on a plane, she and her mother and father and grandmother. A small plane, her father said, but she didn't care big or small. And they would rise into the sky, close to the clouds, close to the sun. They would look down and see their homely island becoming smaller and smaller, diminishing to a tiny pinpoint in the gargantuan sea. Then, like magic, it would be gone. And finally, Patty, who's such a wonderful character. I love Patty. If it hadn't been for the tornadoes, Patty would never have left Kansas. But the season when her husband Rand and her minister Earl were both taken by tornadoes, that changed everything. Before that, she hadn't given much thought to tornadoes. They were a fact of life in Kansas, like hurricanes in Florida or earthquakes in California. But before now, she'd never known anyone who'd been killed by a tornado. Before she left for California, she visited the Jobsville, Kansas cemetery every day. The visits kept her organized and grounded at a time when she had no idea what to do with herself. Life had lost its ballast. She got by well enough on Rand's Social Security and the small nest egg he'd left, but there wasn't much to fill her days. The craft work she used to do, knitting, crocheting, needlepoint, no longer satisfied her. Baking seemed senseless when there was no one in the household to eat what she baked. She saw her closest neighbors, Bill and Cora, frequently, and she was fond of them, but she hated being a third wheel. The cemetery was a 4-acre plot at the top of a drumlin, dotted with oak trees that were often overtaken by crows, enormous blackbirds, aggressive as rats. She spent the most time at Earl's grave because he was always more of a talker than Rand. He wasn't garrulous in a bad way, he just loved conversation. He had a booming voice that surged up from underground, ignoring the confines of coffin and earth and stone marker. He was always an outside-the-box thinker. Even if he had known she didn't believe in God, he wouldn't have minded. She could never bring herself to tell Earl or Rand about her disbelief when they were alive, especially not Earl. Most people in Jobsville thought of Patty as a highly religious, and in some ways she guesses she is. She's always tried to be kind. She likes people, almost everyone really, and she feels the sorrow of others intensely, sometimes too intensely, Rand used to say. She always went to church because she likes church-going people, their hopefulness and the way they value being together. Also because she likes to sing. Oh, how she loves to sing. Hymns, pop songs, spirituals, advertisement ditties. Singing was one of the greatest lures of church. But God has never sat well with her. Who or what is God anyway? And where does he or she operate? Does God have a body, skin, any definition at all? Or is God like water or air or like some Disney movie fairy floating here and there? For Patty's money, all this God business is hocus pocus. So she has always tried to avoid saying God unless she's singing. She made that contract with herself long ago. She wouldn't use the word in conversation, but it's all right to say it when she sings. Since she has a carrying voice and their congregation was small, it would have been obvious to everyone if she were to omit God in the hymns. She made a point of spritzing Earl's gravestone with citrus cleaner and wiping it down with a cloth. Earl never minded much about cleanliness, but she felt it was always easier to communicate when there was no dirt in the way. It wasn't the same with Earl gone. Not the same at all. The congregation had no money, had never had much money, and Earl never expected to be paid a cent. He survived on whatever the 40 or 50 congregants could pull together. They would never find another minister like him. He wanted to preach because he had such a passion for it, and because he found everything about life to be wondrous. He not only tolerated people in the congregation, he found ways to cherish every last one of them, making their little band of worshipers all feel they had a place in the world. Without him, and of course without Rand, Patty had grown restless. The last time she visited the cemetery, just before she left for California to live with her sister Barb, she tried to explain to Earl why she was leaving. I hate to go, but I get shaky in the knees when I think about another tornado season coming through here. If I stay, there's a good chance I'll fall apart. She waited for Earl to respond, and sure enough, his voice came through, full and strong. The crows seemed to take note, lowering their screeching. Patty, you're not going to fall apart. I have faith in you. You were put on this earth to do something big. It's time you realize that. You're a talented woman. Oh, Earl, the only talent I have is singing. Singing is good, but you can do even more than singing. What, though? You never know. You need to stay open to what it might be. You remember that gal who came here a while back and stopped the tornadoes? Of course she remembered. It wasn't the kind of thing you could ever forget. The tornado was a terrible troublemaker, and that young woman stood squarely before it and insisted it vacate the neighborhood. Her bravery made a deep impression on Patty. Oh, Earl, I can't do that. I'm just a big, fat old woman. Earl was laughing, definitely laughing. Patty, you've got to get over that view of yourself. You're not an old woman, you're an old soul, and you still have important work ahead of you. Find that girl and see what she's up to. I can't go see her if I'm not invited. It's impolite. He was laughing again. Bold, not impolite. She'll understand. You, Patty Birch, you don't have an impolite bone in your body. Oh, Earl. She laughed along with him, flattered, happy. What would she do without Earl? And we'll leave it at that for Sinking Island. That was incredible, and both of these books, I will hold them up, gorgeous covers. They are both incredible reads, so I absolutely encourage anybody out there watching to buy your copies now. I'm happy to get started with the conversation portion. Cai has prepared some answers, so we'll be hearing from her through her assisted speech device. I drafted these questions, so if it looks like I'm reading them, I am. That's just because I definitely prefer to be a little bit more prepared. So I will get started with the first question. Both of your books discuss climate and its effects on the world. But I think the heart of both of your stories is in the younger generation and their acceptance of the growing responsibility to care for both the world and its people. The both of you explore both perspectives, the ones shouldering and taking on these new burdens, accepting this new responsibility, and the ones who have to trust others to help with these burdens, which can be difficult and humbling when they've always been the only one doing it until now. And I can totally relate to that. I think it's such a beautiful through line in both of your stories. So if there's one thing you hope readers will take with them once they finish your book, what would that be? Thea, let's go first with you.
Sure. One thing that I hope readers take away from reading From the Caves, I believe I would hope readers take away something similar to what Sky took away by the experiences that are described in From the Caves. By the end of the book, there's a lot of self-realization, a lot of sense of authorship for one's surroundings and the roles in terms of the role they play in their family and in their environment. And so I'd hope the reader takes away a sense of authorship, or at the very least, a kind of awareness of the stories and narratives that are in their life, how they live in their life, how they hold those stories in their bodies, how they retell them to themselves and to others. Because I think there's a lot to learn there about the past. There's a lot to, based off of how hard it can be, there's a lot to ignore and fail to learn from. And so a growing awareness, I wish that on all readers, because I think there's a lot that we can learn about our past and that's described through stories. And so much of that learning process and awareness, we take that into the future. And so I think it in no small part has a big impact on our future.
I absolutely agree. And I love the role that stories plays in From the Caves. It's such it's weaved beautifully through the entire story. Yeah. Kai, how about you?
There are two young characters in Sinking Islands, Penina from an island in the South Pacific who turns 13 in the course of the book, and Edel from Greenland who is 15. The relationship between Penina and her father Analu exemplifies this dynamic you discuss, the impatience of the younger generation and the reluctance of the older generation to pass the mantle. Penina and Analu adore each other, but Penina is headstrong and wants to take action right away, while Analu is hesitant about doing something wrong or impulsive. This tension runs throughout the book. Edel, on the other hand, is a much quieter soul than Penina, but she knows herself, and her idea of action is to communicate through music. I wanted to show that there is more than one way of responding to the crisis. In terms of the overall takeaway, I hope that readers think about how essential collaboration is in terms of finding solutions. The problem is so huge now that no single individual, even one with superpowers, can fix things alone.
Yes, that's so true, definitely. One person can't fix things alone. And I love that because that also explores, From the Caves also, like Sky kind of realizes that he can't do everything alone, and so does Mark. Mark realizes that he can't do everything alone. And so there's that sense of community in both of your stories and the need for others to help. So I love that. Both of you come up with such incredibly unique characters in your stories, throwing together people from such different walks of life and perspectives. What was the character creation process like, and how did they change and evolve over the course of your drafts? Thea.
Well, my characters, they changed a whole awful lot over the years. I'd say they began extremely one-dimensional. They were almost like parts of speech, that kind of elemental when it came to writing the story. And I know that has a great deal to do with that for a good portion of From the Caves during the drafting process, I was contending with my own grief over the passing of my father. And so I had a lot of need for a new perspective about beginnings and ending, life and death, and storytelling. And so the characters in a lot of ways were that new perspective, that a kind of new lens that I lent to the manuscript that I considered from the caves at that time. So very early on, they were very much like stick figures, where Teller and Sky were simply nouns in a sense. Mark and Ty were more like verbs, and I kind of thought of them in an active sense. And then later they would more represent the different stages of grief, where Mark represents anger, Ty sorrow, Teller bargaining, and then Sky begins in denial and then transforms towards acceptance. And over time, I believe they become more complex. I've learned more about their goals and wishes and desires for themselves and their family. But they still can pop into archetypes that exist in their creation myths that they share with each other, the mother, father, child, elder. And I hope that they've become complex enough as characters that they can kind of fit into those archetypes and explode them a little bit and complicate the term.
I love that, and I love the connection to those kind of allegorical themes in each of the characters. And now that you mention it, I can totally see them. And I love kind of reading stories like that tap into that timeless allegory, and to know like that you kind of framed it from the stages of grief. Oh, that's so touching. That's so moving. So when I reread this, I'm going to be seeing it from a different perspective now. So thank you so much for that. Cai, I loved all of your characters and they were so different. What was your character creation process like?
It is always so hard to recall the process of writing after it is completed, because so much of it happens in a semi-dreamlike state. But I think that for this book, the process of character creation was a little different from other books I've written. For one thing, I had a few characters who I had already invented for Weather Woman, and I knew I would be bringing them along. This included Bronwyn and her mentor Diane, her boyfriend Matt, and Diane's husband Joe. There was also a minor character in Weather Woman, Patty, who became a major character in Sinking Islands. The new characters were developed by thinking first about where they would come from. I wanted to write about characters from places where the climate is really under siege. So I immediately thought of an island, in this case unnamed, in the middle of the South Pacific that is disappearing due to rising sea levels. Analu and his daughter Penina, and Analu's mother Valia, come from this island, and I built them around what I imagined their concerns would be coming from a place like that. Analu is an accomplished fisherman with a strong connection to the natural world, and a special wisdom called mana. Penina, being young and bold, wants to see and do as much as she can. Felipe is also from a climate-stressed place, the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, where there have been extreme water shortages even though Brazil has 12% of the world's fresh water. I also included some characters from Greenland, where the ice sheet is melting rapidly. These characters, aka, and her daughter Edel, were inspired by people I had met when I went to Greenland myself. I really enjoyed playing with this mix of very different people from very different places, and also thinking about how the original characters would change from the people they had been in Weather Woman. Bronwyn, for example, develops more self-confidence, while her mentor, Diane, becomes more introspective and aware of her limitations.
Yes, thank you so much, Cai. That's such a great point. I did love the progression of Diane and seeing her kind of understanding and her not really humiliation, but her kind of just her kind of like humbling of her, how she's always viewed the world and herself. And I think that, just for the record, the computer read out Aka. Is it Aka? Yeah, Aka's name is AKA, but it is pronounced Aka in the story. I noted that. Yes, I loved. So just before we hop off of this question, I won't ask another one, but I just wanted to comment that your character, like each of your characters, were just, for both of you, were just so different and so rich in substance, and I just loved kind of seeing that, and I loved seeing the connections between everybody. And in Sinking Islands, they start off separately, but they come together with Bronwyn, and I loved that when you see them interacting with each other, and how different they are, but they have that shared experience and that shared kind of the goal of learning something great. So I love that. Both of your stories have such vivid locations. From the Caves takes place in post-apocalyptic California, and Sinking Islands visits everywhere from Sao Paulo to Kansas, and a Sinking Island in the South Pacific to Greenland and more, as you mentioned. What made you choose these locations to set your story or your characters? And are there places that you visited that provided you with specific inspiration?
A great question. The connection between my stories and place, in a lot of ways, says a lot about my connection to my home state of California. I grew up in Northern California, and I really appreciate, Kai, what you said about the writing process being like semi-dreamlike, and then kind of remembering where I was in that moment back. It can be kind of a challenge. And building settings in particular feels very dreamlike to me. In that sometimes I'll have dreams and the tapestry of that dream will be a tree I saw when I was 12 with somebody I saw earlier that day, and then a color of a flower that's associated with like a car that I once, it's like all of these little elements and characteristics collaged together. But I think I realized pretty young, I was writing stories when I was a child, that even the most fantastic worlds I wanted to create were still inherently collages of California. There was a weather system or a pattern that was intrinsic to the coast, or it was a path I would walk from a creek that would describe the path characters would take. And so the building of From the Caves, the world that From the Caves takes place in, it is very much modeled after the California Bay Area. I grew up in a large part in Oakland. That's where my dad and my uncles all grew up. And I went to Berkeley for my undergraduate studies. And while I was at Berkeley, lived on the north side. I would work in the city. And so there's a lot of different pieces from that experience that populates the world of From the Caves. Some are very obvious, like the characters march up to the observatory when they go up the bluffs and out into this lookout point. Very much matches the Berkeley hikes they would take to the Big C. There's going to be friends watching, this live stream, that when I say that the caves, their location and the layout are very much modeled after Cloyne, which is a large co-op I stayed in Berkeley that's kind of on the upper slopes of Berkeley. And so imagining rising waters and wildfire devastation and drought, the Bay Area, for the many years I lived there, provided a very rich kind of theater drop that was not inactive in any sense. It was extremely active in my mind. I'm thinking of another example of, I used to work in the East Bay and look out to San Francisco knowing I was going to work there later that evening. And I remember sometimes this kind of fear looking at the city would kind of take over. I'd think how San Francisco is so delicate looking from that vantage. And I think that sense of home and the kind of precariousness of the Bay Area was a very rich kind of playground for my imagination when it came to building the landscape of From the Caves.
That's so great. That's super interesting. And I love, location definitely plays such a huge part in writing. And I love being inspired kind of by real life, locations. I took a scouting kind of location trip to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery last weekend. So doing some research and stuff. So I love kind of being inspired by places that mean a lot to you, or that have that connected with you, or that inspired you in some way, and kind of revisiting that. Kai, how about you? Were there any Locations, yeah.
Our locations were chosen because they are places where the climate has been seriously eroded. I could have chosen hundreds of places across the globe, but I found these particular places very evocative. Sao Paulo, for example, is a very lively, fast-moving city, full of creative energy, but it also has extremes of wealth and poverty. The motto of Sao Paulo is non ducer, duco, which means I am not led, I lead, which kind of sums up the attitude of the place. I liked the contrast between a South Pacific island and Greenland. One is hot, the other cold. One is equatorial, the other Arctic. The fact that I had visited Greenland made it a strong contender as a location, as I could picture so much of it clearly. It is funny to me that I ended up situating the book in places I am very familiar with, an island similar to Lopez Island in the San Juans, for example, and the state of New Hampshire where I spent a lot of time when I was growing up, along with places that I have never set foot in and had to learn about through the internet.
Indeed. Research plays such
Oh,
a huge
yeah.
role, yeah, for sure. I love that you went to Greenland and that you kind of put your expertise and your experiences in this book. Yeah. All right. Now let's talk about climate fiction. So climate plays such an important but such a different role in your stories. But it acts as a catalyst in both books to move the story forward. What made you want to write about climate or the weather, the atmosphere, and why did you choose to write about it the way that you did? Thea?
That's a great question. When I set out to write, a familiar form of, what we now might recognize as From the Caves, I had imagined that I would be describing the end of the world, but that it wouldn't be necessarily in a post-apocalyptic way. I had actually originally imagined that I would be describing a world that was dying of extreme old age, that it was coming upon a natural death. And now I know why I wanted to do that. I think I was still contending with the grief over my father. And so I badly wanted and needed this idea that there was a natural rhythm, a life and death that wasn't just how people live their lives, but also the planet might have this natural death. And I put that idea aside for a number of reasons, but one of them was that kind of coming to the terms with the fact that my father didn't pass away from old age. He died of a sickness. And I had friends that had died during that time, that they weren't dying from old age, they were dying from overdoses or car accidents. And then it doesn't take too many evacuations from California wildfires to realize the world's not suffering because of old age, it's suffering because of climate change. And so I got away from the idea of one death or one pattern, that all of the elements in From the Caves would somehow align, because I don't think that that's the way it works. I don't think that's the way it's working. And so the same way the characters' oral storytelling tradition is a collage of creation myths that they have been kind of using this game of telephone for who knows how long, that it becomes this amorphous creation myth or origin story that they use to keep themselves going forward. That's also kind of happening in the backdrop of this climate fiction setting that ended up basically just gathering a ton of different apocalyptic scenarios and collaging them together to create the world of From the Caves. And then I hope that it kind of makes an interesting bridge there between creation myths and apocalyptic myths, so that we can talk about our present.
Yeah.
So I can explore the present. Yeah.
I love the journey that you took from having it be kind of like an almost kind of peaceful end of the world kind of death to something a lot more kind of violent in that, the climate change kind of, we did this to these people. And I feel like that's such it just makes so much sense for the story that you told, to have it be such so violent in that way, and to have kind of that lingering resentment of like, this is what our actions have done to the future, and this is the consequences of all of this.
And inevitably, it felt more honest to go that direction too, because it wasn't what I set out to do, or might be what I wanted, but that's what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm. That's often how writing happens. You think that you're going to write something, one thing, and then it ends up being something else.
Sure.
But I love that. How about you, Kai? What made you want? I know this started with Weather Woman, but how did this come about?
Change is not one of many issues plaguing our world right now, but is the central issue facing us. In fact, I see it as the most central problem human beings have ever had to solve, because if we don't take some pretty radical actions, we will be looking at our own extinction. I think it's almost impossible to write any fiction these days without the issue of climate lurking somewhere, even if it isn't in the foreground. Also, I have always been obsessed with weather and how it impacts our daily lives. I don't believe that writing fiction is going to prompt anyone to take action, but I think it does become part of the cultural conversation. The explosion of climate fiction says something very real about the contemporary consciousness. We are all obsessing about this in one way or another.
That's definitely true. We are. And I don't know, I haven't read the recent report, but I saw those headlines about that recent report about climate change and how it's getting very, very dire. Catastrophic. So that's such a good point about how eventually, like, whatever writers write, there's always kind of that consciousness of this happening, because it is affecting everything that's happening. And like Thea, you had just recently said it's 100 degrees up there in Portland, and there's those wildfires that are currently burning up, I think, in Northern California. And so there's just, you turn left or right, and there's some kind of natural disaster that's happening because of climate change, or intense heat or intense cold or anything like that. And so so prevalent in our culture today. So I am excited to read more climate fiction. I believe you, Kai, that writing isn't going to solve it, but it absolutely increases kind of the general awareness of it, and you kind of come up with creative ways on how you can, maybe not solve it all by yourself, but like do some small things to help do what you can, which I love. I just have two more questions for you. I wanted to talk about the length of your stories. So From the Caves is a novella. It's quite small, very easy to read, super cute trim size too, very kind of small. And then Sinking Islands is a novel, and it's also an extension of a previous book. So essentially kind of like a sequel. What made you choose to write your stories this way? Thea in particular, I found that writing shorter pieces is really difficult because you have so much to share and create in a somewhat limited space. And I know from reading this that, you could have expanded this into a novel. I could have learned so much more about these characters. Were there times where either of you wanted to make your work longer or shorter? And Kai, what made you want to revisit this world and continue the story of Weather Woman? So we'll go to Thea first.
Sure. Writing shorter pieces is very difficult. I agree. In fact, I'd say that, a number of years ago when I was writing and in the beginnings of writing what would be From the Caves, I was writing short stories, and every time I finished a draft, I felt like, well, this doesn't feel like a short story. This feels like a chapter. And finally, after enough short stories felt like chapters where I wasn't able to get everything compressed into a single short manuscript, I thought, well, maybe I'm writing a novel. Like, let's see what happens. Let's string these ideas along. And then towards the end of the process, I realized that the story, the tension, the character arcs, everything was kind of getting ready to snap. And I knew that kind of, that momentum, I started to see not only, and I'd had kind of an ending in mind, but I saw how all the pieces were going to snap together. And so realized, oh, wait a minute, I might actually be writing a novella. And so it didn't, the story, the container wasn't pre-planned. It kind of just evolved into novella form, and which I was actually pleasantly surprised to discover, because I do love novellas. And so it worked out that way. Otherwise, I'd say the short form of it was very helpful in terms of Skye's fascination with language. He fixates on and is inspired by a number of words that I think the short form helps make some of those word choices pop. Skye has a somewhat limited vocabulary, which can limit the narrative. And there are times that I found the brevity of the writing to really help, especially single syllable words that were very important to Skye. Suddenly that short form can kind of lend us like a more poetic, kind of reading to it, because each word can carry a certain weight.
That makes a lot of sense. I love that process too. Cai, how about you?
When I wrote Weather Woman, I never imagined that I would write a sequel, but when I was done, a few people told me they thought there was more to be said. I resisted for a while, but one woman in particular wouldn't stop bugging me. She felt certain things were unresolved at the end of Weather Woman, where we left the characters in Siberia. The more I thought about it, the more I began to agree with her. Things were unresolved between Bronwyn and her mentor Diane. Also, something else really began to bother me. It seemed as if I had written a book that might indicate that one person with a superpower could fix our climate crisis. I don't believe that at all. I think people all over the world are going to have to collaborate to remedy things and work hard at the local level. Sinking Islands was, in some ways, an attempt to clarify that.
I love that. And I love that. I do agree. I mean, I loved the ending to Weather Woman, but I love this ending to Sinking Islands. I think that it's such a really beautiful way to close the story, and and it's the way that you kind of extended the story and made it so others can kind of take on this power and this responsibility was so beautiful. And Kate, our managing editor at Runhen, always loves to gush about the transcendence of this message, and how for both stories, honestly, how things kind of, we take on these mantles, and we are responsible for kind of pushing them forth into the world. And I love how Sinking Islands closed, and there's just a lot more closure there than Weather Woman had. And so beautiful way to end the story, and provide a lot of hope for those who seem to be kind of like really unsure of how to help their communities, or whether it be through climate change or anything else. But these singular people go back to help their communities in such subtle ways, but they help them in such, the way that they help is subtle, but it's such a huge impact on their community. And I love that message that's sending to readers. All right, so finally, an author is only as strong as the community they have behind them, and both of you have such strong support systems. What is your advice for finding and developing a supportive writing community?
I have a wonderful and supportive and inspiring writing community and artist community. I cannot express enough gratitude for how much that has contributed, not just to this manuscript, but my writing practice as a whole. And advice for someone building their writing community, I would say to seek out both traditional and non-traditional publishing. And by publishing, I kind of mean it in the broadest sense of to make your work public. And then we might think of traditional publishing as submitting work to literary magazines and presses or getting a creative writing degree. And I found nothing but joy in those routes. But I think it's important to pair it with non-traditional publishing. It might mean sharing your creative writing in living rooms with your neighbors, joining a local reading series, talking about your work with your family, just making it public in a sense, so that it becomes that kind of communal, practice. I don't think, certainly none of the stories that my characters tell from the caves exist on their own. They are part of a community, a huge oral tradition, a network of storytellers. And I think we do that in our lives as well. And so reach out to other people, build that web, because I think it just benefits a storytelling tradition.
Absolutely. Kai, what do you think?
I love this question about literary community. Writing is such a solitary activity that it is essential to find others who understand what it is about and can provide support during those rough periods of rejection and isolation. I think I only began to understand the importance of community when I went to grad school and bonded with the other writers in my program. That led me to seek out other writers and maintain relationships with them over the years. Going to conferences and residencies is a great way to find people with whom you are simpatico. Also, having a writing group that you trust for critiquing and complaining purposes. The online community can be very supportive too. I have found some wonderful writing pals on Twitter in particular, as well as Facebook. I try to emulate the writers I know who are supremely good literary citizens, reaching out to help those who are coming up, and doing everything possible to cut through the competitive aspect of the writing world. We are our own best allies, and all of our different voices are needed. I have really loved mentoring the writing students I taught too.
This is so great. I love the sense of community, and I love kind of ending on that note of finding your people and sticking with them. And I think that's, other writers are such a difference, like collaborating with them and understanding them and working with them. And then, that energy that you get when you're in a room with other writers is just unparalleled. So I also wanted to ask that question because Kai has one more.
And Redhead goes a way to fostering community in the best way. And Redhead goes a long way to fostering community in the best way.
Thank you. Yeah, we definitely try. And I think that Kai, I noticed this really when you announced your diagnosis earlier this year, and how the writing community just descended upon you with support and love, and it was just so touching to see that. So this writing community is definitely our people. Does anybody have any last thoughts before we sign off? I want to thank you guys so much for your time today.
No, just thank you, and I look forward to joining you all for more series down the line here.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having us.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so much. And thank you everyone who tuned in tonight. This was such an incredible conversation. I hope you learned a lot. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you next time. Bye.